Okay. All right, and just a heads up for everyone, we are recording this. If that's okay with everyone, I just wanted to let everyone know, but we'll use this to send out to folks that couldn't make it, so. Awesome, are you guys all set?
Yeah.
Cool. Guess I'm starting a couple minutes behind, so sorry about that. Welcome everyone, I think this is our fourth meeting now for our Waldo coordination. Raise your hand if this is your first Waldo County coordination meeting. Cool. Couple newcomers, awesome, great. So we're trying to do this on a monthly basis and have a topic that we talk about at each meeting. I know that LD 2003 has been a really hot topic at the moment. So we're really lucky to get these folks from the state that I'll have introduced themselves in just a second. But before we get started, just to let you know, our next Waldo County coordination meeting will be on October 24th. I think it's going to be here, but we have some logistics to sort out, and that's going to be on hazard mitigation planning and working with FEMA. And we're going to have some folks from MEMA come down and talk about that and talk about the potential for a hazard mitigation plan for Waldo County. That's going to be really exciting. We do have a couple other workshops that are not Waldo County specific coming up. I am blanking on the dates of those, so I'll have to tell you at the end, but they are on form-based code and subdivisions. And those are going to be during the day. I think they're at 1 p.m. But I think those will also be recorded, and I can let you know at the end what time, what the actual date of those workshops are. And for anyone that doesn't know me, I'm Adie Filson. I'm a planner with Midcoast Council of Governments. I live here in Searsmont. It's really awesome that Searsmont lets me use this space. It's been really great to bring people together. And yeah, I'll pass it over to two of you.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Hilary Gove, and this is my colleague Ben, and we're here from the Department of Economic and Community Development, sorry. And we are part of the Housing Opportunity Program, which is a fairly new program within the department to help municipalities implement LD 2003, which, again, the next slide. Okay. Which is a piece of legislation that was signed by the governor in April of last year, April of 2022, to require towns to update zoning ordinances and land use ordinances to increase housing opportunities. So this presentation, we're actually doing something a little bit different. Normally, we really dive deep into the components of LD 2003. But for this presentation, we're doing something slightly different in the sense that we know we've heard from communities like, okay, we've heard about LD 2003, but how do we actually implement this in my own community? You know, we have these land use ordinances or these zoning ordinances, but we don't really know where to go from here. So I am providing just a brief overview of LD 2003, but really just to level set, and then we'll jump into more about steps and processes and procedures that you need to take to comply with the law. So I'm sorry if you've heard this before, but just want to go over the law in brief so that everyone knows what we're talking about.
And after our presentation, we have a lot of time for Q&A. If you either have questions about specific components of LD 2003, all of the normal presentation, which we give, which is very much like LD 2003 101, or if you have questions specific to work that your community is doing, we would love to have those conversations. That's why we're here tonight. So we'll go through our presentation and then we'll dive maybe into the weeds with you or maybe not afterwards.
Great. So broadly speaking, LD 2003 places certain requirements on municipalities. So the first requirement is placing an affordable housing density bonus in communities that have designated growth areas or public water and sewer to increase multifamily housing units. This section of the law applies to communities that have designated growth areas, as well as public water and sewer in communities that have zoning, as well as adopted density requirements. So this portion of the statute will apply to the smallest amount of towns, as opposed to the other two portions of the statute, which apply to all communities just in varying degrees. So the second statute requires towns to add to allow for additional dwelling units on a lot that traditionally would have a single family home on that lot. So that could be in the form of duplexes or triplexes, quadplexes, but just allowing additional density on lots that traditionally would have been zoned for single family homes. And finally, the third major bucket, as we like to call it, of LD 2003 is allowing accessory dwelling units on lots that have an existing single family home. And then another portion of the law that we are still sort of working on, it's a work in progress, is creating statewide housing goals and regional housing goals. So this is onus placed on the department to come up with these goals and then figure out how to translate them to municipalities and regions to support additional housing units across the state. And then finally, another portion that is also related to the housing goals is municipalities need to align their ordinances to comply with the Fair Housing Act and Maine Human Rights Act language. And then finally, the legislation also created our program, and we're here to support municipalities with any type of land use questions that they have related to LD 2003, as well as we have funding available currently to help support with LD 2003. Thank you. Just arrow down on the side. Like, right. So we get this question a lot, and I think that different people might say different things about why LD 2003 matters, but really we see LD 2003 as one tool in the toolbox to increase housing units in the state. There's been this number thrown around for a number of years pre-pandemic that Maine needs at least 20,000 affordable housing units to meet current needs, and that likely is very much an underestimate. So we see LD 2003 as one way to allow additional development in communities that may not traditionally have allowed additional density in certain areas. But it also does allow municipalities to sort of have control over the process, whether that be through subdivision law, shoreland zoning, setting up specific minimum lot size requirements, having growth ordinances. There are certain protections in place to ensure that development doesn't get out of hand based on what your community would like. So now, if there aren't any questions specific about what I just said, I thought we'd move on to sort of what are the next steps? Now you know what LD 2003 is. What's the first step to implementing this in your community? And Ben's going to take that away.
Going backwards. Thank you, Hilary. So as we mentioned, normally our presentation is the 30 seconds that you just got of what LD 2003 is about 15 minutes. So if you do have questions about any of those three parts of statute related to LD 2003, we're happy to dive into those. But for now, we will move forward. We'll talk about kind of what steps you can take to kind of assess your individual community and go from there. So the first step would be to understand what land use documents you have as a municipality and how those relate to LD 2003. So you'll want to take a look at any land use or zoning ordinances that you have, your land use or zoning maps, shoreline zoning ordinances, and your comprehensive plan. This next slide is probably one of the more slides that have more information in terms of how LD 2003 would be applicable in your community. So we generally try to refer to all three of the statutes that are under the LD 2003 process as buckets. So as Hilary mentioned, the three statutes are the Affordable Housing Density Bonus provision, which is 30A MRS 4364, the up to four dwelling unit provision, which is 30A MRS 4364A, and the ADU provision, which is 30A MRS 4364B. All three of those may apply to your community, but they all would apply in different instances. So up on the screen, you can see the different buckets that each of those statutes would apply to. So all the way on the right, the ADU ordinance applies to all municipalities. So every municipality would want to use step one to review your whatever land use ordinances you have on the books, your zoning maps, you would need to make sure that you are making amendments locally to meet those provisions in that statute related to ADUs. The up to 4 dwelling unit section generally applies to all municipalities as well. Each municipality would need to determine particular zoning districts and areas that would need to have amendments to your zoning maps or your zoning codes. Generally speaking, the up to 4 dwelling unit provision means that most places that allow residential uses, most zoning districts that allow residential uses within your community will probably have to have some update done to it. Generally speaking, if it is an area that has public water and sewer, or is within your designated growth area, you would need to ensure that you allow up to 4 units to be built on a lot. And if it's an area that does not have public water and public sewer, or is not within your designated growth area, then you would need to allow 2 or 3 units on a lot. And mostly what we're sharing with communities is that you'd want to look at the use typology, much more so than think about how you build something on a lot. So in essence, what that means is if you previous to LD 2003 only allowed a single family home in a zoning district, you will need to allow something greater than that, a duplex or a triplex, depending on whether you will have public water and sewer, or if it's in a designated growth area, would depend on the number of units that you allow. But how you actually build on the land, the frontage requirement, the land area requirement, most of those other things, you can retain those, or they can stay the same if you choose. Lastly, the affordable housing density bonus would only apply to municipalities that have zoning, and those municipalities that have adopted density requirements and allow multifamily housing. And that would only be in an area that is a designated growth area, or has public water and public sewer. And those 3 buckets are kind of the bulk of a lot of our other presentation. So we're happy to go back to this slide at the end of our presentation, if that's helpful to generate questions to talk about what is LD 2003.
Can I just jump in with a quick definition question? Designated growth area. Is that something that comes to be designating for us, unbeknownst to us, or is that something that you would have designated in the past?
Hold on, Hilary. It's like you're a plant.
Oh yeah, I forgot we put this slide in here.
I just got to get it to go. So, thank you. The definition is up on the screen, but generally a designated growth area would be, usually if you think about a designated growth area, it's the area that you have identified in your comprehensive plan as a place where you expect generally either residential or commercial growth to occur. If you have not had a comprehensive planning process, then you may not have designated a designated growth area. But as you can see on the slide next to me, if you do not have a comprehensive plan, then that designated growth area means the area in which there's a public sewer and public water area that has the ability to have extra growth in it, or it's an area that is identified either in the census as a census designated place, or is it designated in 23 MRS 745 as a compact area of your urban compact, which is related to MDOT and the way that they do some of their cost sharing components. We can broadly speak about those areas, but the 2 of us generally don't know what areas that you and your individual communities have designated as those components without looking them up. Generally, if you are uncertain of where those areas are, we would recommend working with the folks at MCOG who can help you try to determine if you've ever identified a designated growth area in a comprehensive plan in the past.
Would you prefer folks to defer all questions to the end, or are you comfortable answering questions along the way?
We're happy to do questions on the way.
Yeah.
Town of Waldo.
Yeah.
Comprehensive plan dated 1993, adopted under the original Growth Management Act, has a growth area of about 1 square mile. never been implemented from a zoning perspective. This was stated to me is that if you have a comp plan that's more than 10 years old, never adopted zoning to implement the growth management area, that what you can do is that you do not have to adopt the dual standard for housing. Meaning that you give a bump to the areas that are within a growth area versus what's in the remainder of the town. And the Waldo Planning Board right now is looking, right, implementing the law. And we just want clarification as to now whether or not we actually have to give a bump for this 1 square mile area that's never had any zoning attached to it compared to the remainder of the community.
There are definitely multiple ways to answer that. I think the provision that would impact you the most would be this middle bucket. So if by bump you mean additional density, then you would need to ensure that that particular area, even though the comp plan is outdated, that particular designated growth area does allow up to 4 units in that area as a use typology.
So there's
But if you have not-
that isn't accurate, where what Waldo is going to have to do is have 2 standards in its land use ordinance. One for a designated growth area that it's never implemented, even though it's in the conflict, by putting a zone status with it. And for the remainder of the community, we can go with the lesser threshold of not having to allow 4-plexes.
Is it a current comp plan or any comp plan at any time?
Our advice is that whatever comp plan you have on the books would dictate what you need to do for LD 2003. We know that a lot of communities have very outdated comprehensive plans that don't necessarily reflect what they want to do in their community currently today.
We'd like to eliminate the growth area because it has no value.
So we have been telling communities that if they are nearing the comprehensive plan process or in the middle of the comprehensive process, that they should make Band-Aid fixes for LD 2003 to comply with the law. In the off chance, well, maybe not an off chance, I don't know, somebody comes and says, hey, I want to build an ADU or I want to build a duplex on this lot. Town should be prepared for that. However, then you could go through the comprehensive plan process and then revise your statutes, revise your ordinances in accordance with that new comprehensive plan. But just because your comprehensive plan is outdated doesn't mean that you don't need to comply with LD 2000.
Would be in full compliance at the present time, and you'd have to really establish a standard of 4 units of 4-plex in that 1 square mile area.
If that's where your designated growth area was
Yeah.
last identified,
Mhm.
yes.
Yes,
I don't see no service.
that is not, because you have a comprehensive plan, right? It does not
Mhm.
need to be on public water and sewer. But it would have to have adequate water, so, and waste services. So it's not to say that, you know,
Mhm.
any development can happen if a septic system couldn't accommodate the extra.
As I was saying, and again, our other presentation kind of goes more into these weeds, but this middle bucket is really looking at the uses, so making sure that you allow that someone to have the ability to build that 4-plex, if you will, but that there are a bunch of other safeguards, whether it's water and wastewater capacity, whether it's the amount of land area that you require for additional dwelling units, whether it's your frontage requirement, all of the things that you utilize already in your zoning code to either allow for density and component and structures to be built on a lot, or have as an impediment to those structures being built, still exist and are still mechanisms in which you can utilize in your code. You just need to make sure that you are allowing someone, you're giving someone the ability to create something that's of a greater density in their use typology.
I would just make a general comment to a lot of those in the room is that everyone in this room, in this municipality, probably has an adopted comp plan. Everyone has an adopted comp plan, has a growth area. So everyone's going to need to pay attention to actually creating 2 different provisions in your code, even though you likely don't have zoning.
And-
Very few communities in this area actually have zoning districts They just have land use ordinance.
Correct. And I think that it's difficult for us to know exactly what each community needs to
It's a
do.
backdoor way of putting zoning into municipalities where it really wasn't, it isn't really the approach that the local towns of 900 and 1,100 folks have used. And the fault isn't with you, the fault's with the legislature.
Right. We understand that, but we're also happy to look at your individual ordinances to see what actually needs to be done. Because,
It needs to comply with the law.
well, yes, I know, but as far as redlining it to see what actual changes you need to make, because it's difficult for us to know exactly what the exact language of your land use ordinance is to make sure you're complying. So we're happy to take a look at it. And I certainly don't want to speak to say you need to do something that you don't need to do without actually looking at your land use ordinance. So.
Something else that I'll also add is that you don't actually need to have a growth area in your comprehensive plan. It's something that most people don't realize, but you don't have to have a growth area. So, for example, if you didn't want to implement the up to 4 dwelling unit section, and you were able to convince your town to go through a comprehensive planning process, you could take out the growth area.
If you go back to the original growth management law, which is where my guess is a lot of municipalities' comp plans still come from.
Yeah.
It required you to have growth areas and rural areas. So it wasn't, hey, think about it. It was, you gotta do it.
Right.
And if you didn't designate them, your plan was gonna be rejected by the state.
Right.
Mhm.
Now you have to designate, you still have to like decide a growth area that's nearby you. But for example, if the town of Brooks agreed that you could have the town of Brooks's growth area be your growth area instead of having it, for Waldo, it might not make sense because you're such a small town. So
Are you saying small towns can just negate the growth area?
you still have to designate an area of growth. It just doesn't have to be within your town.
And you have to go back and make the comprehensive.
I don't understand what you mean not.
So you would have to request an exemption from DACF when they're reviewing your a comp plan update.
But there is an exception. I don't know why. I think maybe because of the old the old Growth Management Act, I'm not sure when that was implemented that you could do that, but that is a thing now that you can designate it outside of your town.
In 88, it was implemented in 1990, 1991, 1983.
Yeah.
And
Tier
it's
one, tier two, tier three.
it's worth, I don't remember if we have it in this slide or not, but it's worth, again, repeating that the functionality that exists in your code for how you allow structures to be placed on a lot still can exist. So if you want to have a minimum lot area of a large amount of acreage, you can do that. If you want to require a lot of frontage so that you can minimize the ability to build on a lot, you're able to do that as well. Generally speaking, at least for the principal dwelling unit provisions in 4364A, you can still have a rate of growth ordinance in which you are essentially limiting the amount of permits you're giving. There are still avenues in place to limit growth if you do have concerns about that.
Most of the things you talked about rate of growth ordinances, they go way beyond the administrative capability of small. And it just isn't where it's at.
Okay. Can I just piggyback on that? Are you saying that a small town could say, okay, 4 units, gotta be 6 acres with 500 feet of road frontage?
As long as it was the same. So you would need to, if you're doing that, you would need to require 6 acres of land area for a single family home,
Got it.
6 acres of land area, an additional 6 acres of land area for the next dwelling unit, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so you have to change the entire picture. Very good.
Just want to go about this dwelling unit definition, because there are separate buildings, there are dwelling units within existing buildings attached and so forth. Can you clarify what you mean by dwelling unit?
So there's a definition provided in our rule. I can grab it later for you. Yes, but in the terms of talking about 38 MRS 4364A, typically you might have a single family home on a lot. But then in some situations, based on the size of the lot, the dimensional characteristics, setback requirements, if all of those are met, then there's potential to add maybe a duplex, or you could add another freestanding structure. There are different ways that the ordinance allows, that the statute allows municipalities to structure the ordinances to allow the increased density on a lot. So there is some flexibility there as far as if it's, attached to the primary structure, or if it's, just a 3-unit building, or there are different ways that can.
It doesn't count the same way as far as fulfilling the law.
Yes. Yes. Yep.
Did you have a
Well, I was
question?
gonna ask you, some states I know dwelling unit has to have kitchen and bathroom, is that a component?
A municipality can use that definition of dwelling unit. I know that there are, I think it's in the shoreland zone, I believe the definition of dwelling unit uses like toileting and a kitchen. Our definition is taken from Maine state statute, but that doesn't mean that a municipality can adopt a different definitions to meet their needs.
So we'll keep going through our presentation, but if you do have questions, feel free to ask them as we're moving forward. So step 2 was to kind of try to understand how LD 2003 applies to your community. Step 3 would be actually creating those ordinance amendments. So as we've kind of talked about quickly, that may be something that is a complex task for your planning board or ordinance review committee. If you have an ordinance review committee, you may not need to do anything if you're a town that either doesn't have zoning or a town that doesn't have public water and sewer or a designated growth area. There may be less that you need to do, but you will need to draft and amend those land use documents. We don't have it up on the screen, but I think it's important to share that the timing for LD 2003 has recently changed. So is there anybody in this room that is not a town meeting form of government? Perfect. I assumed most of you had a select board and you had town meeting to move forward with ordinance amendments. So for everybody here in this room, and I assume most people that are active and listening on Zoom, that date is now July 1st of 2024. And that is the date in which you need to comply with state statute, in which you would need to have already had your town meeting vote and have those ordinance amendments or whatever needs to be done to meet the requirements of LD 2003 done. I'll get to you in 2 seconds. And if you are a community that doesn't have town meeting, if there's anybody listening on Zoom or listening to this recording, folks that use a council form of government or something that isn't town meeting to establish land use ordinance amendments, that date is January 1st of 2024. And that's the date in which they need to have everything situated for their land use amendments. Go ahead.
So one doesn't have complete control over town really. Suppose for one reason or another, the effort to comply doesn't go through, what happens?
I think that has yet to be seen, right? But I think that what would happen is a town might have a situation where an individual townsperson sued the town because they would like to build something that they were subsequently told they couldn't build. But that hasn't come through the courts yet. So I guess it's to be determined. But we do suggest that if you do have real concerns about that, maybe talking to legal counsel about it would be the best course of action, because we are not municipal attorneys, so we don't want to provide legal advice to towns.
So the next couple of slides relate to those ordinance amendments that you'd be drafting. Questions that you will want to review as you're thinking about components are, do you have zoning beyond shoreline zoning? Do you have density requirements? Do you allow multifamily housing? Where? Do you know where your growth areas are and where public and sewer is located? Do you have anything that could be a comparable sewer, public water sewer system, which is would be a large scale privately owned system that operates in the same way that a public system does? And then do you have parking requirements for multifamily housing if you do allow multifamily housing? That's all for, I know it's kind of blocked on by Zoom, but that's all for 4364, which is the affordable housing density provision. I don't know if any of the communities that are represented here allow multifamily housing, but that section would only be applicable if you have zoning and you allow multifamily housing. If it's not, you don't have to worry about that particular provision for the most part. The next section, 4364A, which is the up to 4 dwelling unit section. Yeah, there's like only 10, but you're welcome to pass it on. You would want to determine where your residential uses are, which zoning districts they're in. Again, where your public water and sewer is located, where your any comparable public water, comparable private systems for public water and sewer are, where your growth area is, and if you have any lot area restrictions or requirements for lot area in town. For the ADU ordinance, you would want to review your ordinances to make sure that you don't have an existing ADU ordinance. You will want to ensure that where you'd want to know where your residential uses are allowed in which zoning districts. You would want to review your shoreline zoning ordinance to determine if there's any prohibition on ADUs in that language as it exists today. And then you would want to just review if there's anything on your ordinance as it stands today regarding non-conforming or illegal ADUs, non-conforming lots, and if you have an ADU ordinance, review the parking requirements. Lastly, for all 3 of those requirements, all 3 of those statutes, you need to know what type of form of town government you have to understand the applicable eligibility date. You need to determine how you determine adequate water and wastewater. Is that through a code enforcement officer? Is that through a permitting process? Is there some other process in which you do that? And then you would need to determine, which we'll talk about in a second, if there are choices where you may do something versus you have to do something. You'd have to determine if you're a community that wants to do those extra steps to have the may provision.
Does the law provide any prohibition on municipality bumping up the subsurface wastewater standards under this legislation?
The law needs, your ordinances need to comply with Maine state standards for subsurface wastewater, which is set by.
More stringent.
I would talk to the DEP about that.
Belfast adopted these standards 5 years ago, basically for ADUs and also for a lot of regulations. When we wrote those standards, we bumped up what the amount of subsurface was because of the concern with somebody putting 4 units in a rural area on subsurfaces. So we didn't say no, but we said if you're doing it, you're going to have 1/3 more capacity than what you would for a single-family house. And it was looking at environmental considerations where you hadn't had fourplexes in the past. And so what I just heard is that it's inappropriate, illegal, probably stronger, for a municipality to have a stricter subsurface standard than what the state would require.
I would still defer to what DEP says about that, because at minimum, you need to adhere to what the DEP standards are, but I don't know enough about the subsurface wastewater rules to know what's permissible, what a town can do to amend those rules. So
The state has no concerns with us on these standards.
I think
worked
you
for
would
the
talk
town
to
of
the
York years
DEP
ago,
about that.
And the town of York had a standard that where basically you had to design your system for 1 extra bedroom, without one extra bedroom, universal, simply because the soil quality. And it was looking at the environmental considerations, which folks often have, and where the law does recognize that on zoning. So I would just indicate that it may be good as when we move, especially in new territory, to provide some tools to municipalities to make sure that they're not going to be creating problems on neighbors' properties.
mean, you're right to say that in some situations with like shoreland zoning, that there are abilities for municipalities to not just take the model shoreland zoning ordinance and make it their own, but I just don't know enough about the subsurface wastewater rules to feel comfortable. Right,
The town of York
right.
has had it at least, it's not in 92. So it's something that isn't new, it's been
Mhm.
out there for 30+ years.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's just always good to check with the current standards, because things do change. And you just never know, so if you are thinking of introducing some sort of change, it makes sense to
And also,
check, even if it used to be, some things get grandfathered in, and it's okay for certain towns to keep it, but if you try and do that now, it could be not permissible for some reason.
and I believe there are certain rules related to LD 2003 that are in the rulemaking process with other state entities right now. So what we are citing to sort of now in our current rule might not be the case moving forward, because those other entities are doing their rulemaking process. So that's why we rely heavily on those other organizations to sort of help us, like shoreline zoning and with subsurface wastewater. We are not experts on that, so we really don't want to say anything that could be wrong, because that makes their life more difficult too. So we really defer to their expertise on that.
My guess is that part of your role as well is provide information back up the ladder, particularly to the legislature, to see if this thing actually works, which I think is a big question mark.
Yeah,
Is that in doing so, I would encourage you to think about tools that municipalities can use. They're pretty simple to be able to ensure that when you start allowing a fourplex on a lot that used to be only a single family house, that the subsurface system has the ability to do what, has the soils to be able to support.
Yeah, we do have reviews. We have a provision in which we'll be sharing information to the legislators in the next session. And we're happy to have some components on that. Generally, as Hilary mentioned, we would be deferring to DEP for those standards. But it certainly is something that we could loop into concerns about adequate water and wastewater capacity. To our point earlier, LD 2003 will require you to allow those use typologies, but all of the provisions, whether it's DEP standards or local standards regarding capacity and ability to serve for wastewater and water capacity, those are still things that, however you certify currently, that you would be able to utilize the same process. So if you determine that the soils cannot support additional septic components, or that there is no interest in building out a public water or public sewer system, that's a fine answer. But you would need to, in order to comply with LD 2003, you would need to potentially change your a use table or the way in which you look at uses to potentially allow a person to build a multifamily unit if they have the ability to have the water and wastewater capacity for that structure.
Excuse me. I think this is where the soil guy is going to go out and do the soil test. He knows he's going to build a fourplex. He's going to have to check that property over and do a fine-tooth comb to make sure that's going to work.
Correct.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That might put more burden on them. You know, it's going to be more money, but that's what you're paying for.
Correct.
I'm sure it's going to work in some places, but not every.
We'll breeze through kind of the last little part of our section so we can make sure that we have, we can keep going through your questions too. But I want to note that what's up on the screen is all of the May components of each of the statutes. So most of the components of LD 2003, most of those 3 statutes are musts. So those are things that you do need to make sure you're complying with. What's up on the screen is anywhere where there's a may in LD 2003. So these are things that you can choose to do if you are a community that wants to do some of these components. So that includes being more permissive than the dwelling unit provision, the 4 dwelling unit provision, allowing something, a density that's greater than that. That includes having some sort of prohibition for not allowing someone to remove an existing structure and then remove a dwelling unit and then build a new dwelling unit using the dwelling unit allowance. You can, if you don't already, you can create a application or permit process for housing structures. If you don't currently, you can implement fines for not meeting those permitting requirements. And then you can also have less restrictive components for variances, of which that statute is the variance statute. And I can only broadly speak about what that would entail because there's a lot and it may be different for each of your communities. But if you have a variance and a Board of Appeals process, you could establish something that is less restrictive for granting those variances as it's related to the additional density provision. For the ADU provision, you can choose to allow ADUs and accessory structures. You can choose to be more permissive in your dimensional requirements, including the setback requirements for ADUs. You can choose to establish a maximum size for ADUs. Current statute sets a minimum size of 190 square feet, but for an accessory dwelling unit under 3464B, you can set a maximum size of the accessory dwelling unit. You can choose, if you like, to create a permit process that doesn't require planning board approval for an ADU. You can also impose fines just like you could before. And you can also have a less restrictive ability for granting variances for accessory dwelling units. And lastly, we actually just had some questions on this earlier this afternoon, but the LD 2003 provision states it very briefly kind of doubles up on what you could already do for short-term rentals. So it makes sure that you're aware as a community that you may choose to regulate short-term rentals if you would like, and that you can, it follows an existing state statute on short-term rentals. But if you so choose, you can regulate short-term rentals as well.
That's even if there's nothing about short-term rental in the comprehensive plan.
Correct. But I would preface that with check with whoever you use for legal services, just to make sure that whatever you're writing as an ordinance makes sense and does meet any housing goals if you have housing goals in the comprehensive plan.
Maybe a good question probably is, and maybe it'll be answered by the definition of dwelling unit. What's the difference between dwelling unit and addition as well?
Yes, that's an excellent question because it really does matter for LD 2003. So in our rule, and I will get that out later and I can show that around to people instead of reading it off right now.
Pull it up online.
Yeah, I can pull it up online, true. We provide definition for a dwelling unit and accessory dwelling unit. So we took those definitions straight from state statute. However, we know that some municipalities didn't really like our definition of accessory dwelling unit because it didn't adequately recognize that an accessory dwelling unit needs to be subordinate to a principal structure. So there's a lot of wiggle room for municipalities to define accessory dwelling unit as they see fit. So I know that there are other ordinances that have examples of ADU definitions that also work, even though they're not word for word what we have in rule. And we're happy to provide additional examples if that would be helpful as well. But there's no one right way to do it. I think you just do need to do it in ordinance in order to distinguish between a dwelling unit and accessory dwelling unit in terms of what's permitted on a lot based on the characteristics of that lot. Because there are less restrictions for ADUs.
On the standard that comes in on Airbnb short-term rentals, if you do not apply it universally throughout the municipality, can you only apply it to the accessory dwelling?
We've seen that actually from a few communities.
So that is something that's municipal.
In their ADU ordinance, yep, they're regulating short-term rentals, knowing that ADUs commonly can be used for short-term rentals.
That was Ellsworth, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
I
yes,
think,
yes,
I think it was
Ellsworth, yeah.
Ellsworth has a ordinance like that they're drafting.
That predated the law.
They had an existing ADU ordinance, but their LD 2003 amendments are focused on what you just asked, related to short-term rentals and ADUs. Do you want to just do steps 4 through 6 and then skip?
Actually, I just have a quick
Mhm.
question. My understanding was that you didn't need a planning board approval for ADUs by default, and that the option was to establish a planning board approval process. But this says the opposite.
Correct. LD 1706, which was the bill that amended LD 2003. That had a process in which what's up on the screen is the that you may establish the permitting process. But both that provision and LD 2003 still allowed you to utilize some sort of a permitting process for accessory dwelling units. It wasn't necessarily by right. But LD 1706 was making sure that everybody was aware that it was a you can establish that permitting process, or you can, sorry, saying it backwards, that you could establish a process that didn't involve permitting if you so choose.
Did not involve permitting,
Correct.
but you can also,
But you are able to have a permitting process if you would like.
That requires planning.
That
board
requires planning board approval or other approval.
but is there what is the default for, like, if you didn't have a planning? I don't know, so do you have to specify either having a planning board approval process or not having a planning board approval process?
Not to meet the requirements of LD 2003.
So if
I
you put
see.
on your land use table as allowed.
Yes.
Yes, if that's what you
Yes.
would like to do.
Yeah.
So does the code officer have the authority and or known if there are two accessory dwelling units and a new house being built, which adds to 3?
So Adam,
Does that still constitute, I know the different company, Waldo, does this still constitute something?
so you could say in your ordinance to meet the minimum standards of LD 2003, that you're only allowing one accessory dwelling unit on a lot with an existing single family home. So the addition of 2 accessory dwelling units at the minimum of LD 2003 would not be allowed.
Say it again.
So the minimum standards of LD 2003 is you must allow 1 accessory dwelling unit on a lot with an existing single family home.
What I'm looking at is the idea is that we're now, and I understand, but is that we're coming in as if someone says, what I'm gonna do is build my single family house, and I'm gonna have 2 accessory dwelling units in a detached structure, adding to 3 units.
You,
So
you can't double dip like that,
Qualifies as a subdivision.
but you can't double dip like that per the minimum requirements of LD 2003. So you either choose, we like to say sort of choose your own adventure as a lot owner, right? So if you have an existing single family home, you can either put 1 accessory dwelling unit on, or you can take advantage of 30A 4364A, which allows you to maybe potentially put a duplex or a triplex on your lot, depending on the lot characteristics.
I'm starting construction, I want to, that's the way I'm looking at doing it from today. No, coming off the ground. So my question is, does put 3 units in, does it constitute a subdivision under the law?
It could, because it's 3 or more units, but you wouldn't, if your ordinance doesn't allow for that, then that wouldn't even become a problem. Do you know what I'm saying? Because if your ordinance doesn't allow multiple accessory dwelling units on a lot, then that wouldn't trigger subdivision. But I see you're saying if there were 3 or more units on a lot, that's correct.
There's nothing in the law that negates the subdivision requirements.
Correct, exactly. Yes, yes.
Would it make a difference if it was a 3-family building or 3 different buildings?
for LD 2003 or for subdivision?
Either or. Because when I think subdivision, I think 3 separate buildings. That's a
Units and lots are one and the
subdivision.
same.
What
Units and lots are one and the same under the law.
these guys are saying.
Subdivision laws, units and lots are one and the same. So if I build a triplex, it's the same as if I had 2 single family houses or 3 different lots. for the purposes of subdivision.
And there's timing mechanisms and other stuff in there too, depending on,
But are you guys saying that you could only have 3 units on a lot to meet LD 2003 if they're all built at the same time? Is that what you're saying? If you have a single family, you want to add 1 accessory dwelling unit, or you're gonna allow 1 accessory dwelling unit, that's 2, single family, an existing single family, and then new accessory dwelling unit, that meets 2003. But if you're gonna add 2 accessory dwelling units, are we required as a town to allow 2 accessory dwelling units?
No.
yeah, no, LD 2003 under 4364B. You are only required to allow 1 accessory dwelling unit, and that would be on a lot that has an existing single family home. If it's a lot that has an existing duplex, the only way that an accessory dwelling unit could be added would be if you permit that. If you as a community decide you are okay with a duplex having an accessory dwelling unit as well. Similarly, if you are a community that wants to have multiple accessory dwelling units on a lot, you can choose, it's one of these maze, you can choose to add that into your code, but that's not required under state statute. You just need to allow the 1 ADU on the 1 single family home. And that's only thinking about it as an accessory dwelling unit and 4364B. Hilary was mentioning before that there's a provision in LD 2003 and the same provision in our rules which prohibit someone using both 4364A and 4364B. So theoretically, if you are a person that has a single family home, once you have moved through all of your ordinance amendments and you want to add a new type of dwelling onto your house under these 2 provisions that we have up on the screen, 4364A and 4364B, you could either add an accessory dwelling unit onto your lot under state statute, or you could add additional density of up to 2, 3, or 4 units, depending on whether you have water and sewer and the things we talked about before. But those 2, 3, and 4 dwelling units would be considered principal dwelling units. So that would be the duplex, the triplex, things like that, versus the accessory dwelling unit, which is different. I know that gets confusing. We'll pull up in a second some of our definitions, which may help some of the components of understanding what that all means.
Too, if you had like some scenarios, because I mean, this is spaghetti soup, and I love those choose your own adventure books when I was a kid, but this is a lot more difficult.
You're a great plant. If you want to just
Yeah, so
quickly
we
go.
do have a few scenarios of we understand that each town has a very unique way of structuring land use, right? They have different documents. They have, sometimes they have 300 pages that talk about land use. Other towns may have like a 3-page building permit. Exactly. So we try to provide some examples of where a town may fit in, knowing that if you have further questions, please come see us, because we're happy to look over what documents you do have and to try to parse out what you need to do. So this first town, which we call Town A, not very exciting, but it's probably not relatable to your communities, but we still wanted to provide it as an example. So Town A has zoning. It has 3 designated growth areas. It has a comprehensive plan, and it has public water and sewer. And they also have a 200-page land use document that has a variety of different sections, like non-conforming structures, shoreline zoning, building regulations, dimensional standards, etc.
You're pretty much describing the series model with that example.
Great, perfect, great, that's awesome. So good. So I'm glad this is applicable and not a waste of time. So essentially, what does Town A need to do to comply with LD 2003? So all sections of LD 2003 would apply because they have zoning, they have adopted density requirements, they have growth areas, and they have public water and sewer. And they also allow multifamily housing. So that would really be the first bucket of LD 2003, which is the affordable housing density bonus provision. So this type of town would need to do the most work to comply with LD 2003 because all three statutes apply. And likely, since they have a very lengthy land use ordinance, it would likely require somebody to go through all the definitions that are in their land use ordinance to make sure that they are meeting the standards of LD 2003 and that you have definitions for all these terms, because maybe in the past you never had an accessory dwelling unit ordinance. So now you want to define that so people know what it is. So that's sort of step one, is looking at definitions. What needs to be updated? And our rules provide a lot of definitions, but there are certainly other definitions out there that could meet the requirements of LD 2003. Like shoreline zoning, for instance, also uses some common definitions for terms. And sort of step two is thinking about, okay, so we need to comply with all three parts of the statute, and likely we're going to have to create a new section of our land use ordinance that would allow accessory dwelling units and also the affordable housing density bonus. And those, in some situations, could be sort of a cut and paste, like new section in the land use ordinance, depending on what you already have on the books. Maybe you have a section about multifamily housing already. Maybe you just need to do it some tweaks, but it really sort of depends on what you have already in the ordinance. And then also, as Ben mentioned earlier, you want to look at your dimensional standards and use tables to see if you're allowing like duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes to at least allow for that use to happen. Whether or not somebody's able to do it is a different story, but you need to at least allow it in your ordinance. And then, as I said, having an own separate ADU section is probably the easiest way to do it. So making sure that you have, you know, setting the minimum standard that you allow one ADU per lot with an existing single family home. And then you can establish minimum sizes, which is 190 square feet, or a maximum size, which isn't established in ordinance. We know some towns are doing owner occupancy requirements because of their concerns about short-term rentals and things like that. So there are a variety of ways that you can structure an ADU ordinance to meet your needs, as long as you're meeting the minimum requirements of LD 2003. And then the last thing I just wanted to note is, likely if you're following the DEP guidelines on shoreland zoning, you likely will not have to touch your shoreland zoning ordinance. That probably, unless you have a straight up prohibition on ADUs in your shoreland zone, likely you won't have to touch that to comply with LD 2003. But certainly happy to look at any documents if there are questions about that.
So why again would you not have to touch the shoreline zone?
Because that's established by the DEP, and essentially LD 2003 says that shoreline zoning still applies across the board for any type of lot that's in the shoreline zone, acknowledging that there are other protections for those lots.
Sure.
Exactly, as long as you don't straight up prohibit ADUs in the shoreline zone. Shoreline zoning applies across the board.
So your minimum lot size, as you have the minimum lot size in the shoreline zone, we could potentially have 2 units, 3 units, or what? Because right now, based on what District 300, 30,000 square feet, so if someone has to have a 60,000 square foot lot within the shoreline zone, they can have 2 dwelling units on that lot.
Assuming you're meeting all of the DEP guidelines, then yes. Then yes.
Like water.
Yes.
water
Shore
and-
frontage is
Yeah.
gonna be the bigger
Mhm.
barrier to development within the shoreline zone.
The other question I have, which made by Sears one and Sears one, the other, what do you base the density bonus for affordable housing on?
So the bonus,
So if you're, I'm gonna use again, Belfast existing standard.
Mhm.
For most areas in Belfast, for multifamily housing, is 19 units per acre. So is it being suggested by the law that Belfast only needs to allow like 47 housing units under the density bonus?
that's correct. If that's what they define their base density as, it's 2.5 times the base density is the number of units allowed.
Belfast is being penalized for having had a very thoughtful provision put in for multifamily houses based upon the height of structure that it allows, which is 38 feet. When you look at parking requirements, and I understand parking requirements have been looked at, you're not going to get there. The last 3 housing projects built in Belfast for affordable housing didn't even approach the 19 unit per acre standard. So I'm just suggesting, again, when you look at the law, and I'm counting on people such as DECD going back into the legislature law, right? You're looking at the law, you should not penalize a municipality who adopted a very appropriate and aggressive standard for multifamily housing that hasn't even been touched by the affordable housing projects that have been built. The same, what they need to do is suddenly take a 2.5 times formula.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that the developers need to meet that high number, right? It just allows for it. Right.
To a neighbor. And the 19 units per acre cost concerns some persons. If you suddenly say that it could be 47, which blows everything out of the water anywhere else, it doesn't seem right. So I'm just asking you to think about it.
I would counter that. I am a neighbor of the, development being built on Thunder Street. And I'm incredibly grateful for it. Professionally, I was working. So it's really interesting. I'm very interested to be listening and hearing what sounds like probably a different point of view that I have, but I think if you could go 2.5 times that base density, that would help a lot of
Yeah,
people.
recognize that Congress Street has been built in about 13 weeks.
Yeah.
They didn't meet the 19 of which were allowed. That was a decision they don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm not making it a right or wrong as far as where it is. I'm just suggesting that 47 units in a municipality that has basically a 3-story height structure.
Right, but,
isn't something that's realistic.
but I think what Hilary just said is that they don't have to go to that they don't have to meet that limit.
The fear of what's allowed drives people more than what actually occurs.
And the backlash. is what you're saying.
Yeah. I see
That's
that.
the option.
Yeah, the option is there, but does it not exist for a reason?
Are these density bonuses typically in our comp plans? Or the density standard.
I've never seen one in a comp plan.
Where
Generally it'd be somewhere in your zoning code or land use table. Different communities have used it in different manners. But for the dwelling unit per acre requirement, some communities actually spell out, as you're saying, that it's 19 dwelling units per acre. Others have a land area requirement where it's 30,000 square feet per dwelling unit or something else like that. Some communities have something different, and we for this instance, until you have a presentation you can go to in a couple weeks, we will ignore form-based code because that's a whole different beast of an animal. But if you want to listen into MCOG's presentation on form-based code, it's really unique and interesting and gaining some steam, and I'm glad to hear that you guys are doing a presentation on it.
But it also might be possible that you don't have any adopted density requirements. So in which case this wouldn't
Yeah.
apply to your community.
So. Example 2. Would that be lesser?
Yeah, I'm sort
Yeah,
of
they
like
kinda
trying to go down, you know,
Yeah.
sort of like the maximum to maybe the
Sounds like-
minimum, knowing that there's definitely gray areas in between.
It might help to start with a minimum
Oh, sure, we'll go to the third one.
and then work.
Don't we start later?
Too late, no, we have.
We have to go in order?
Don't go to B.
Okay, we'll stick with order, but,
Yeah.
Okay,
There was an
so
idea.
town B has shoreland zoning and then identifies the rest of the town as a general zone. They don't have growth areas and they do not have a comprehensive plan. They also do not have public water and sewer. And they have separate ordinances that aren't in all one document on their website that are like subdivision, land use, shoreland zoning, planning board. But these are all separate documents that are super lengthy. So what does town B need to do to comply? So because town B doesn't have zoning, adopted density requirements, nothing on multifamily housing, they don't have designated growth areas or public water and sewer, the first statute does not apply to them, so they can just forget about it.
So in the middle, that's in the middle bucket now.
This is the middle bucket town, right? So unless ordinances were to change, they wouldn't need to do anything. or comprehensive plans were to change. They would not need to comply with the first statute. As far as the second statute goes, they would need to review what they do have on the books for ordinances and allow for ADUs. So creating potentially its own ADU ordinance, or maybe you could have it in the land use section, really depends on how you structure it, but that would have to be its own section. Looking at definitions, if you have any, to make sure that they are accommodating for things like accessory dwelling units, which might be a new term used throughout ordinances. And then also, if you have to comply with the additional dwelling units on a lot section. So looking at any use tables that you have or dimensional standards that are there to make sure that those comply with LD 2003. And then again, same thing for town A. Town B likely wouldn't have to make any changes to shoreline zoning to comply with LD 2003 because they're complying with DEP standards already.
So what are changes to dimension, like what dimensional standards would they have to change in order to comply?
So for instance, say that they didn't apply their minimum lot size proportionally to each unit. So for instance, if they had, say, one unit is 10,000 square feet, 2 units is 15,000 square feet, 3 units is 45,000 square feet, they would need to adjust it to make sure that it's 10,000 for each additional unit that's added.
Or less,
Or,
less.
yes. So less square feet for the additional units. And also mentioning that ADUs are exempt from any type of density requirement as well.
And parking.
For
Yes,
ADUs
for
only.
ADUs, yeah.
Yeah.
There's something for folks that's recognized that you can't put a parking stand on you.
But you can for the additional like duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes portion. That middle statute doesn't have any parking requirements, where the first statute, the affordable housing density bonus, and the ADU do have parking provisions in the law. Yeah. So then the last town C has shoreline zoning, but they do not have any general land use ordinances. They have only a 3-page building permit ordinance, which does not go into any detail about types of structures or uses allowed. They have 2 growth areas, and they do not have public water and sewer. So they do not need to comply with the first statute because they don't have zoning. While they do have growth areas, since they don't have zoning, it doesn't matter. So at a minimum, this town just needs to review what it does have. In this case, it is essentially a parking ordinance and a building permit ordinance. So in some examples that I've looked at for towns that may fall into this bucket, there's actually nothing that they need to do because technically the uses that are allowed in LD 2003 are already allowed in that community. They just don't spell it out. So for those communities, they have 2 options. One, maybe just have your lawyer look over it just to be safe and do nothing, assuming the lawyer says you're all good. Or 2, we do have municipal grants for communities if they're interested in doing a more robust overhaul of what they do have, if they would like to be more explicit with land use planning.
You're referring to municipal attorneys. That's not a reality in our community. You have grants to help us pay for consulting attorney.
Yes, we are allowing communities to send us requests. We have it's what we call a municipal payment distribution schedule, where we are saying that communities with zoning can come to us, or communities without zoning can come to us, but there may be sort of caveats related to communities without zoning. But generally speaking, we do have buckets of funding that we can help towns to comply with LD 2003. But it sort of depends on, which bucket you fall in, whether you have designated growth areas or a public water and sewer, how much money you can get from us, but we do have funding available. So we do want towns to have legal review of these things because we certainly are not qualified to think about all of the potential situations that could happen when you update land use ordinances. So.
And that funding is either $5,000 or $10,000, depending on whether you have designated growth areas and public water and sewer. The information related to all of that is on our website. It's not a lengthy document, but it's more than we can really quickly talk about without like having a specific presentation that we do on it. But if you are interested, either take a look at our website or email us and we can share information.
You have your website address or?
We
Uh,
do at
I
the
think maybe on the
end.
next
Yeah,
slide.
Yeah, I can send a follow-up email with,
yeah, with our email.
yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to.
Yeah.
What's your turnaround time on a request?
The request can go fairly quickly unless you fall into a bucket of a town where we're like, do you actually need funding? In which case we have a review committee established with MMA and we're gonna review them. Otherwise, if we think you're all good, it takes about 1 to 2 months to get the money out to towns.
Because most people are having town meetings in March.
Mhm.
So there's not a lot of time.
Don't worry
And
about that.
the
That's
process-
enough time on our end to get our ducks in a row, but thank you.
Well, it may require a special town meeting too.
Right, right.
And if you take a look at our payment schedule, it talks about all the eligible, any applicable use of the funding, which would be notices for either your regular town meeting or a special town meeting. It would be the administrative cost of doing some of those town meeting components. It'd be administrative costs about creating the ordinance itself. And it spells out what those applicable expenses would be. And then it spells out what you need to do as a community to ensure to us that you have met those requirements, which would be actually adopting the ordinance.
Also, we know that towns are going to be dealing with LD 2003 and until at least July 1, 2024. So we're aware of that. And we know that if you're incurring costs around that time, then you could still get reimbursed for those costs. But we're just trying to meet towns where they are, whether they've already incurred costs or we're saying, hey, we'll give you the money up front. Just let us know how you ended up spending it.
Have you awarded any projects, any grants yet?
Do you wanna-
Grants or these specific payments?
These $5,000-10,000?
Yeah, we have about 50 that we have are
Yeah.
in the process. I don't remember the exact percentage that have been paid, but they're going through the process of sending the checks out. But we've had about 50 requests.
You're saying if the ordinance doesn't pass town meeting, we give money back?
So we need to see the whatever ordinance language that has been approved. So I would say if you have problems at, especially if you're doing your annual town meeting and you have problems passing the ordinance, to reach out to us and we can talk about what next steps could look like. There are obviously differences between our answer and requirements for our funding mechanism and ensuring that your community is in compliance with state statute. And I think they're two different things. But if you do go through a town meeting process and you're unable to pass the ordinance amendments, then reach out to us and we will try to guide you as best as we can.
So is there a review process, sort of taking out of the equation the financial assistance? Once a town puts the work into adjusting their LUO, does it have to go to you
So-
for, like?
No, so this LD 2003's requirements are different than like a shoreline zoning.
Yeah, that's what I'm-
So we don't have any review authority, so you are hopefully using our assistance, using the assistance of regional planning organizations. And guidance from legal counsel to draft an ordinance that meets the requirements of LD 2003. We gladly review provisions. We've worked with many communities across the state to take a look at what their planning boards are reviewing. But we don't have the ability to give you a yes or a no, like in shoreline zoning. We would heavily recommend that you consult some sort of legal counsel. Both if you have concerns about the actual amendments passing town meeting, but also if you're moving through your ordinance provisions and you just want to make sure that someone in legal has eyes on it. Because we aren't saying yes or no, if you do not comply with it, you would be setting yourself up for potential litigation. And so that's where we're really saying, we want you to speak with legal counsel to make sure that they believe you are meeting the provisions of LD 2003, because that would be the person that's kind of having that second set of eyes to say yes or no.
So you alluded to this earlier. It seems like it's a little bit of a moving target. The DEP's got an opinion. There's obviously other organizations affiliated with state government that's gonna have input and opinions. And I mean, I don't know who, whatever you heard about the whole, can't remember the name and number of it, but with the tax break for seniors, was a complete debacle.
Mhm.
So how are towns gonna know every time this is tweaked?
Well, as far as LD 2003 goes, we are the point people for that. So we have been putting out, we have a listserv, I'll say that we put out information on LD 2003 specific. Although we try to keep our toe in what DACF, DEP, DHHS are doing, but we don't work for them. And so that, sometimes state government, there are a lot of entities. We do our best to keep track of it and we can try to do our best to send it out, but we don't work for them.
Are
So we're
they
not-
able to tweak LD 2003?
They meaning those other state agencies? Generally speaking, state agencies and individuals like us that are working for those state agencies are usually not doing policy-based things. So generally, if there was going to be a tweaked LD 2003, it would come from a legislator. So it would move through the bill
Just like they
process.
changed the date.
Correct, yeah.
Correct.
And so how are, I don't know who's here, planning board, select people, how are we gonna know?
It sounds like you can get on that list or specifically
You-
for Elder.
And
Yeah, you can get on our
Yep.
listserv. We've been giving a lot of shout outs to the Joint Select Committee on Housing, which is a committee of both state senators and members of the House of Representatives through the state that are focused on housing related issues. They are the lead committee for most housing related bills that go through at least the current session. They have a listserv that you can jump on. I would preface it with if you do jump on their listserv, you'll be inundated with all of their work, which last session was like 100 bills. So if you want to get deep in the weeds of what policy is moving forward in Augusta, that would be a great way to do it. But if that's too much, but if that's too much and you just want to know LD 2003 related things, you can email us on the email that's up and we can get you on our listserv.
also the Maine Municipal Association does a fabulous job of keeping abreast of LD 2003 related issues and are very much on top of it. So I know that they have put out things to their member communities about LD 2003 and its changes and sort of policy decisions around that. So they're also a fantastic resource.
And MCOG has been doing a great job of sharing relevant information and having a lot of really good informational sessions over the last 18 months or so as well.
Yeah, so you can, even if you're not a member of MCOG, you can sign up for our mailing list and we put out regular emails with update. We do a monthly newsletter and then I have a specific mailing list for MCOG communities. So, if I get your email, I can add you to that and I will send out updates through that as well.
Put it on the list over there.
And she's really good at it. We rely on Averill.
At the end of your presentation, you mentioned fair housing standards as well. What under LD 2003 has had an impact on fair housing standards?
Those fair housing, so the exact language of the law is essentially saying that municipalities need to comply with the Fair Housing Act and Maine Human Rights Act in accordance with our statewide housing goals. So we're in the process of creating those statewide housing goals. So right now we don't have like an excellent answer for that because those goals haven't been created. But essentially the Fair Housing Act, generally speaking, is trying to ensure that ordinances are not discriminating against people based on housing types, such as like group homes or multifamily housing. So LD 2003 is certainly promoting different types of housing, which is very much in line with the Fair Housing Act and Maine Human Rights Act.
See, that's the law that.
Correct, that existed before LD
So it's
2000.
Yes.
not- We're not really a change.
No,
We're
I,
looking at how to make the better performance.
Correct, it kind of doubled down to make sure that communities across the state were making sure that they were implementing that. And one way that you may work with someone from MCOG on, if you use MCOG and you're a member community, is if MCOG or another agency is working on your comprehensive plan, they may find a better way to spell out that your housing chapter of your comprehensive plan meets those requirements. In which, if you had written a comprehensive plan years ago, you may allude to fair housing, but you might not actually spell it out.
So I think approximately 2 of the communities represented here have zoning, and one of those 2 communities has public water and sewer. So for those communities that don't have zoning, could you go over how they would get access to funding so that I guess it would be that $5,000, because I think originally they weren't eligible for that.
Yes, we're in the process of working with MMA to create a review system for those communities, knowing that even though you don't have zoning, you may incur costs related to LD 2003, and you may have very detailed land use ordinances, but you don't have zoning. So to be fair to those communities, we're in the process of setting up a system to review what that town has on its books for land use ordinances. So I would say the best way to do that, if you're interested in receiving money, is email us, and then we can go from there.
If you go on our website, you can, as I've already mentioned, you can see the payment schedule and what's needed, what information we would need from, generally would be someone from town hall. We have received some information from planning board chairs, but what we'll need to start that process is an invoice. So usually it's from a town manager or your clerk or someone who has access to things in town hall that would normally be receiving or sending out payment components. And we need that so that we can get whatever process is in place for them to receive funds from the state, so that we can make sure we're sending electronically the funds to the right place. And I know that probably most of you, or if not all of you in the room, don't know what I'm talking about. That's totally fine. But someone in town hall should have as part of their job a way to accept payments from the state.
You're essentially saying we need to spend the money before we can apply for the
Nope.
grant.
You can
Nope.
either send us information, you can either send us that invoice first.
I would get an invoice if we haven't.
I would say
Just-
email
yeah.
us, and we'll tell you what you can, or we can have a phone call with you, either or.
Yeah.
I think that's the easiest way to explain it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm guessing it's like a quote, right? You get a quote.
Similar to that.
Yeah, and upfront, we're really not requiring towns to provide us with anything because we know they will incur costs. It's just a question of how much. So we're saying, okay, you either get $5,000 or $10,000, and when you're done with the process, let us know how much you spent. And if you have to give funding back, then you have to give us the funding back. But otherwise, like if you spend 10,000, we gave you 10,000, it's all good.
I'll go find a way to spend it. Especially from the state.
And that's what we want towns to
Yeah.
use this to, right? We want them to spend the money on this, so it's all good.
We have a man for the job right over there.
How up to speed is the legal community with this?
I would say relatively up
Yeah.
to speed.
Yeah.
We did a roundtable with, they were generally Portland-based attorneys, but we did a roundtable with representatives from most of the big Portland-based law firms at the beginning of the summer. And they were asking very much in the weeds questions of talking about prefacing about a client and what a specific community was trying to work through as they were looking at ordinance amendments at the beginning of the summer. I would say probably if they are a firm that does offer municipal legal review services, they probably are well aware of what they need to do, and they probably are working with communities across the state already.
So there's been outreach beyond Portland.
Yeah, and MMA's attorneys are all very much aware, and we
Yeah.
work closely with one particular point person at MMA in particular about specific towns or concerns that she has as a lawyer working with communities.
Oh, great.
But also, I mean, we do, We do answer some questions from lawyers, so like if your specific lawyer has questions, we're happy to answer that as well.
And a large, we kind of jumped over what our role is outside of doing these presentations, but a large part of our role is technical assistance. So I think we mentioned, but if we missed it, we are happy to talk to your planning board as a full board. We're happy to talk to a select board. Just to do a general presentation of what LD 2003 is. It's not this presentation, but it has some key aspects of what we've talked about tonight. We are happy to review your ordinance with the caveat that we are not attorneys, so we would encourage you to have an attorney review whatever you are drafting. And then we're happy to chat about any of our financial components and hopefully find ways to get you money to do all this stuff as well.
One other thing, I know this presentation kind of focused on, or at least the examples, they focused on like the minimum things you had to do. But say, for example, all you have is a building ordinance. And what are you able to use those same tools to regulate ADUs in terms of like setting a maximum size or yeah, along those lines, for example. I think
You
that's
mean
a
without
lot of
establishing like a land use, or what do you mean?
yeah,
Like
without establishing, so I think a lot of towns around here don't have land use ordinances of any kind, but they have, you know, a building ordinance or dimensional requirements. But, you know, so maybe they don't have to change anything, for example, but if they wanted to add some regulations to around ADUs, are they able to do that legally?
I would say, you know, each town is different, but probably there are that if you have a building permit provision, you could certainly find a way to tweak that or to add something different that focuses on if you wanted to have a maximum square footage of an ADU, or if you want to talk about characteristics of an ADU, you could do that. And I hope this doesn't confuse too many folks when I reference what I'm about to reference, but there are certainly towns that have, in a similar vein, chosen to opt into marijuana when they don't have uses and they don't have use typology, but they've created a license or other permitting structure.
Right.
So you could look at, if you don't have that, you could look at what other communities are doing for different types of permitting outside of just your building permit.
Right. So I think that's like the main thing for a lot of you towns is you might not have to do a whole lot to change your ordinances, but it's a question of how do you want to add in regulations or stipulations? And so thinking about that. So that's something that we all can help with. So we can, you know, get to that outcome. If you say this is what we see for our town, we can work with you on how to get there. That's not, I don't know if attorneys are generally as good at that aspect. They're really good at like making sure it's legal, but maybe not necessarily like getting to that outcome through how the different stipulations you put into
or
an ordinance.
workshopping it. more
Yeah,
so.
workshopping it. So like just know you can workshop it. There are things you can do. It is what it is to some extent, but we can make it work a little more so it's tailored to your towns.
And do you have for our town meetings or the educational process? Because I know in our town, if it comes from the state and it's a requirement, we don't want. Not everybody says that, but you know, the idea is the regulations come down, they keep changing, they get more complex, and it's a lot of work. And people don't want restrictions on the property. So my question is there going to be sort of a couple paragraph description available that says, okay, I mean, obviously we have all the stuff you gave us, but that would be useful. You know, what is it? Why is it? You know, why is it happening so fast? Because it will be some backlash. Sure.
We don't have that currently, but we can certainly, we're trying to refine the educational materials that we are creating. I would also say lean on MCOG or other regional agencies to do some of that. Obviously, whether it's DECD or MCOG, we're kind of stuck within the confines of sharing information beforehand. We can't generally really touch educational things that would be on the warrant article or would be handing
Well, of
out
course.
pamphlets to folks.
I'm just talking.
But we could certainly, whether it's us doing a workshop or MCOG doing some educational components, there could certainly be some push as you're leading up to town meeting.
If you hit a cold.
Yeah, and that's what the $5,000 or $10,000 covers is like informational meetings, or, you know, any expenses around that. And I think that's probably gonna be one of a lot of the main uses, like if you wanted to establish short-term rental regulations for your ADUs, a lot of times that, you know, you'll have to do some outreach ahead of time to get people on board with that. But yeah, you can certainly help with that.
Is there a reporting function going back up to the legislature?
Yes, we are required to submit a report on like early
January
January
something.
of 2024.
And seeing as probably no one has really fully implemented 2003 by that time, who hasn't already done? What will you be reporting?
We will be reporting on probably all of the things that we've done like this. We will be reporting on the money that's gone out the door. We will probably be reporting on the towns that we know of that have. But yes, you're right, that this report is due prior to the full implementation.
One
of
of
the
the noted, Belfast adopted the path to accessory homes community standards in 2017.
Mhm.
Since 2017 was before.
Mhm.
Belfast has had, well, I'll call it cash and duplexes since 1985. So it's they way past what this.
Mhm.
So information such as that to be made by some real life information to folks who look at this as being the grand fixer, which it won't be.
We don't disagree with you there.
It's not.
Yeah.
But it's the idea is that where this isn't something where one day you had a housing problem
Mhm.
and the next day it's solved by adopting ADU standards.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think that the legislature is very well aware that this is a very multifaceted problem and that LD 2003 is a tiny puzzle piece of that problem. But you're right. I think that the data won't be there when we report on it because it won't have been implemented and we won't have the ability to look and say, okay, in Belfast or in Searsmont, they did X and therefore in the following 5 years, this housing development happened, right? I think that will have to come.
And while LD 2003 did set that date, and we don't remember which date is in January, but there's a specific date set in LD 2003 for January 2024 in which we present that report to the Housing Committee. They at any point are more than able to ask us to report out to them. We have spoken with them. We spoke with them in their past legislative session and gave them a quick kind of report of where things were somewhere in this early springtime. And then I would assume that that would be part of their conversation, that they would ask us to come report back to them at a later date once more communities had adopted LD 2003 provisions
One
as
thing
well.
I suggest is there's probably data out there from a lot of municipalities, based on what the ordinances that in the past. And I know you have them, that the more of that type of data we can start feeding into a system, may start giving folks a little bit better sense of about what else we do.
I think
Definitely.
that if
So-
you
Yeah.
want to talk about the housing goals,
Yeah.
just quickly, that might be,
Um,
and then we'll
the-
get to your question.
We are trying to be the best clearinghouse that we can be, with the caveat that that's only a small facet of our job, but we are trying to gather ordinances that communities that we know have passed them. Part of why we're asking you to send your ordinances into us, if you're when you're using our funding is exactly for that. So that we know that, again, we aren't going to be approving, we're not going to be saying yes or no, but we're trying to have the ability to understand what's worked and what hasn't, and who's having challenges with passing things in town meeting. And if you ask us, what communities have started to think about short-term rentals in ADUs, we could say, well, these 5 communities are the communities we would suggest reaching out to. Additionally, we've sort of breezed past it, but LD 2003 did require our program and our department to create housing production goals for the state. We are in the middle of a study with a consultant who is gathering housing start data. So they're trying to understand how many units we currently have within the state of Maine, how many units we should have within the state of Maine, and then based on expected future growth, what our need for units would be in the future. That report should be available at some point in the fall, probably in the early fall. Generally speaking, those housing production goals would be based on broad regions within the state. So you as a municipality probably don't have a whole lot to do, but we are trying to gather data to understand how much housing is actually needed within the state, and more importantly, to predict what future housing needs we have as the state.
So you all keep referencing short-term rentals and ADUs. My impression was the LD 2003 is to provide housing for people, not to provide short-term rental options defined as less than 30 days.
That definitely is the goal of LD 2003. But from our perspective, since the law essentially is saying municipalities may regulate short-term rentals, it's a may, so towns can do it, but they don't have to. But you're right that maybe if you're not regulating it, then there'd be more short-term rentals in your community. But that is an individual choice for municipalities to make.
Even though it's completely counterintuitive to the whole purpose of this law.
Well, it's counterintuitive to economic growth. In small towns,
Right.
it's a way to, increase the tax base and grow your community. If it keeps people here, they have a home-based business.
And there's certainly pros and cons to short-term rentals, so I think that and towns will just have to grapple with that, which is, I know, a very, very, very daunting task.
Oh, yeah, something really quickly, if you do have feedback about LD 2003, that's like one of the roles of regional planning organizations like MCOG is to collect that sort of feedback, and then we can send it up to the state level. So I'd recommend reaching out to me. MCOG has also applied for, the Housing Opportunity put out a grant program for service providers. And as MCOG is a service provider, we've applied for this funding to study, to do a housing study. So, I don't really know how much of a difference, LD 2003 is going to make, but we'll be taking a baseline assessment of supply and demand, developer capacity, and a whole lot of other metrics that'll take place over a year or two. And then there's additional funding, I believe, that's coming out. So I think there are some opportunities to really look into the impacts of what LD 2003 will have, but I think LD 2003 is generally understood, maybe overstepping a little bit here, but as something that was mostly meant for Southern Maine in a lot of ways, that was dealing with a lot of the problems that Southern Maine was having. And so it may be sort of like unbalanced in the effects that it has in terms of like, maybe it will have a lot more impacts in Southern Maine. In rural areas, I think it's going to be a bit more of a toss-up, and it's going to be affected by the cost of building an ADU or an additional dwelling unit, and are there developers? And so that's what we're really looking to understand through this study. you know, if we really want to increase housing, you know, is LD 2003 really going to, you know, make massive changes? Probably not. But what are the steps that if we do need to, you know, create more housing for local people, what can we do? And so this is, yeah, like you are saying, just a piece of the puzzle. And we're here as regional planning organizations to really work with you to make sure that you're covered as best as we can cover you, and to, you know, this LD 2003 is not perfect for rural communities, but we can work on making it the best that it can be.
That was well put, because that is what happened.
Now, is there a possibility that the deadline could be pushed further?
Only if somebody puts in legislation. I haven't seen anything as of right now.
All your legislators.
They really, it came, the extension came at the very, very last minute. I can't imagine it's gonna be pushed back again. Especially the reason, I think the main reason it was extended was because the funding assistance hadn't been established yet. But now that it has sort of a complete year, I think it's unlikely that it'll be pushed back another year, but you never know. But if you want an example, so Lincolnville has recently gone through this whole process and has established they have amended their ordinance, and it's been accepted by the town. So there are towns that have gone through this already. And I think mostly they're larger towns who could afford at the beginning to shell out the money or have the capacity in-house to go through with their amendments. So there are towns around here that have done it.
And we've consulted with some of the original legislatures that had moved the bill forward in 2022. It definitely was, at that time, it seemed like a year was plenty of time. But one of the challenges was our program didn't exist yet. So we are the folks that do rulemaking. We didn't exist as a program yet. So while we worked really, really hard to get rulemaking done as fast as we could only do that once we were hired. So I think a lot of the conversation initially for pushing back the deadline was actually related to the rules that we've created, which are the way you actually would be applying the legislation locally, which we got together much quicker than many other state agencies generally do. But in general, that was one of the challenges, was we needed to get rulemaking done so that you knew what you needed to adopt as your ordinance amendments.
Is it appropriate to ask what sort of backgrounds you had?
Totally fine. Actually, in some of the other presentations, we do that as an introduction. Prior to taking this role, I've been a professional planner. Prior to taking this role, I was the planning director for the city of Bath. I worked for a couple of communities beforehand. I'm always happy to be part of MCOG related things. I was on the MCOG board for a while as Bath's planning director.
My background is in state government. I am a graduate of Maine law, and then I was working at DHHS as doing strictly rulemaking. And then I have other experience doing contracting with the state and just sort of working with state entities.
Are you the staff?
Yes, we're the only two. We're the two staff for the Housing Opportunity Program.
Yeah.
There are many other folks in our broader department, but we're the two folks that do this program.
You've done a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been very helpful. And do you see this as sort of a short-term role? Among other things, or?
Technically, it is a short-term role because we're actually limited period positions. That could change, but we have funding for like another year and a half or so. But for the next year, we're really trying to help communities get over the hump of LD 2003, and then I suppose our roles could change. But yeah.
If you have any other questions that you don't think of tonight, our information is on the screen. Email us, give us a phone call. I know our number's not up on this one, but reach out to us if you have questions. We are, like I've said a couple times, we really want to help. So let us know how we can best be helpful for you, for your community, and how we can assist MCOG and other folks that are helping you as well.
Are your slides on your website?
These aren't, but it was recorded.
Yeah, so I recorded this and then are you guys able to send me yeah, I can send out a copy of the slides. So if your email's on that list, on the sign-in sheet, I'll send a copy of the slides and contact information and all that good stuff, so.
And we have some hard copies here if you want to take some home. Not enough for everybody, but enough for most
Well,
folks.
you
if you
might
wanna
have,
take
there's
some.
4 of us, if there's not, we'll share one, so that might be.
Good, saving some costs. Great,
Yeah,
thank you.
thank you.
Thinking maybe if I just get your email address, I can email you the goal. That would help me. You probably won't.
We need more coffee.
Yeah.
One of these.
Definitely
or
go for
two
it.
of them.
Yeah.